So thank you, friends, for being here. I think I'm so sure the people will also join. They just simply broke for a tea and coffee. But sir, it's honor to be here with you, and it's really a pleasure to, in fact, learn specifically on the topic which is disturbing, bothering, and kind of a flavor of a season now for all the CFOs, CFO communities, and the whole finance professionals, largely, but for everyone otherwise. Uh, so friends, the topic of this particular discussion is the importance of ESG. And as we have been having discussions with various CFOs who has put ESG and specifically the sustainability on the top of their list because of various regulations, and also as a factor of a simplicity and an importance. So that's where we will try to decode and understand what is ESG, what is the importance of ESG, and how we should head towards that, what is happening in the industry. And I don't think we could have invited someone better than Mr. Rajan for this particular session, who has been very vocal about this particular topic. He has also written a book on the same. So, Mr. Rajan, I'm not going to talk much, but just shoot questions to you. And the first foremost is, why is there a need of ESG? What purpose does it serve?
Well, really, ESG is an approach for corporates to demonstrate their commitment to corporate responsibility. And it is an approach that really encompasses the expectations of all your stakeholders. So it's quite a simple sort of way of thinking about your duties and responsibilities as a business and how you embrace the expectations of all your stakeholders. That includes not just your shareholders. In the past, there used to be a view that the role of the firm was really to deliver surpluses and returns for the shareholders. There was the old Milton Friedman School of Economics, which encouraged that thinking. But I think that has changed substantially in the subsequent decades. In 2019, you had the Business Roundtable in the United States, which has, I think, a number of the Fortune 500 companies as members. And for the first time, they also categorically changed the perspective on what is the first and absolute commitment of the corporate and moved it from shareholder returns to looking at your stakeholders and the kind of values you create for your stakeholders. So I think it's really an approach that companies are finding useful to figure out how you address the needs of other stakeholders, your employees, people in the community, civil society, your customers, the needs of the environment, and integrate that. So it's quite a straightforward kind of way of thinking about it. In the 1990s, a lot was made about the triple bottom line. This is all an evolution of, I think, thinking that's been around there for a very long time.
Sure. So let me shoot two parts of questions. It's a flavor of season now, ESG, because I have been, looking at industry, and they come with maybe a different term every 2 years. Initially, the rally was towards CSR, employee benefits, but now suddenly everyone started about ESG. So give us a perspective in terms of how should corporates, CFOs, India Inc. embrace ESG? How should they look at ESG? What are the ideal ways maybe the company should look at ESG or maybe embrace ESG?
So I've been a sort of vocal advocate for the fact that any kind of substantial change, any way of integrating some of these concepts into your business strategy has to start right at the top. So if you're asking how does a company actually embrace an ESG agenda, I think the first and most important thing is there has to be a buy-in at the level of the chairperson and board. So in a sense, you talk about the tone at the top, right? That has to be intact. Then you have to have a governance structure that provides guidance, both within the organization and communication externally. I think increasingly in corporate India, you're seeing many companies appointing, for instance, chief sustainability officers. At the level of the board, often they create an ESG committee of the board. In some companies, you talked about CSR, they've combined this with the CSR committee's responsibilities. So instead of creating one more committee, you're just renaming the CSR committee as the CSR and ESG committee of the board. And sometimes a director is given the responsibility of piloting the ESG agenda. So between the committee head and the sustainability chief of the company from the management side, you have some locus of governance. then you need to really ensure that this is embedded in your mission and purpose. There's a lot of talk about, purpose-driven capitalism, but again, I'm a big fan of that, and I can talk a bit later about my own experience with the Tata Group, where I spent many years. But I think it's important, if you want true alignment between all your stakeholders, it has to be something that features quite prominently in your mission statement, your core purpose. Once you've done all of that, so you've got the tone at the top, it's embedded in your mission statement, you have a locus of governance, then there is, of course, a huge amount of communication to rally people internally and to also explain to the markets where you stand as a corporate, what your intentions are. And then, of course, you get into measurement. And depending on, there's this concept of materiality. What is material for your organization business, and therefore which metrics in ESG you're going to pursue quite strongly and report very vocally. You decide how you want to measure and then what you report. And obviously, no measure is complete without some targets. So you establish targets and then you demonstrate that you're making progress from year to year. That's the route that, the best companies will follow. And I think there are a bunch of them in India. All the things that I mentioned are now happening in many companies. You also have, obviously, regulatory pressure. You have the BRSR requirement. For instance, if you're one of the top 1,000 listed companies, many of the BRSR governed companies are now doing all of this. So I think at least 200 companies now have formally a person who's called a Chief Sustainability Officer, and so on and so forth. So I think there's no rocket science. But the important thing that I will say is that it has to be something that you're serious about. You're not just paying lip service. And it is embedded in your mission statement and your corporate purpose. If it's not, chances are it is lip service, and you're doing it just to tick the box and produce a report because some regulator is asking for it. But I can assure you, I think there are enough stakeholders, including investors, shareholders, customers, who are now going to be watching quite carefully. And because of the BRSR, you have data that is coming out, including data that from next year will also be audited. And when people see that data, they will form their own conclusions on whether these are companies that they wish to back, companies whose products they wish to buy, and so on. So I think people need to get serious about it if they aren't already quite serious about it.
Certainly quite meaningful, because a couple of years back when I read the news that JP Morgan hired Chief Sustainability Officer, and that rally I see now in India. In fact, I recently came to know that SBI shifted its DMT's designation to a Chief Sustainability Officer. And very interestingly, in their Q2 results in the investment presentation, they said they have planted 700,000 trees in 2 quarters. Again, a lot needs to be done, but good beginning. But sir, what I learned from a lot of specifically the finance people and the CFOs is, implementing ESG specifically is a major challenge because of lack of technology, lack of funds, lack of manpowers. So any alternatives, any suggestions you have for that?
So the first thing that I want to sort of clarify is ESG is not only about environment. Typically, environment is where maybe a lot of the cost aspect, capital investment sort of comes up, and particularly now with the climate challenge, you will see a lot of that happening. But there's also an S, there's also a G, and a lot of times these don't actually require huge amount of resource commitment, but they require an approach, an attitude, a state of mind, if you will. Let me give you an example. If you talk about diversity in organizations, you need to have a policy, right, which encourages diversity. And if you have that policy and a lot of your processes, including your recruitment processes, are aligned with that, then you're good. You don't need to spend money to have a diversity policy. You don't need to spend money to make sure that you have at least the compliance requirement of a lady director on the board and maybe more. If you chose to have more representatives from different communities, including the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe communities, people with disability and so on, it's not going to cost you, right, to appoint such people on your board. But if they're able to give you insights that help you to better serve a very diverse market, maybe it's actually in the company's best interest. So the first point is not everything in ESG costs or requires technology or requires money. A lot of it is simply having the right policies and executing those appropriately. The second is, even where something may cost money, it isn't that it has to be spent all at once. And I think the best example of that is the climate transition. you hear about these net zero targets, right? India itself as a country has a net zero target. The target is, as of now, 2070, which is almost half a century away. Most of us will be dead and gone by then. But the point is there is a target, and there will be slow, maybe incremental steps that the country will start taking. There are then shorter term targets. So by 2030, for instance, we have targets. We want to potentially deploy 500 gigawatts of non-fossil fuel-based energy, for instance, by 2030. We want to improve the energy efficiency of the economy by 45% over 2005 levels by 2030. So those are shorter-term targets. So if you look at some of the big multinational companies which have also taken on board net zero targets, Unilever, for instance, has a 2039 target. Now the thing is, nobody has said that they're going to be net zero next year or the year after next. So ideally, that's what you'd want in order to address climate change. But they are talking about targets that are somewhere in the proximate future, maybe in the next decade or 2 decades. Many Indian companies now have gone down the same track. Reliance Industries has said 2035, they're going to be carbon neutral. So people are now starting to put out targets, but none of these targets are so proximate that overnight you're going to have to change business models, or overnight you're going to spend billions of dollars and potentially risk the entire operations of your company. So the idea is explain to the markets what is your position, try and put in place a policy, a climate policy, for instance, set out a target, which is something in the near future, because at the end of the day, we all have to care about climate change, whether it is an existential issue, and then start taking incremental steps to deliver on those targets. So even on the environmental question, I don't think that everything under environment requires spends that are immediate or tomorrow. But what people would expect, what stakeholders would expect is at least there is clarity on how the company is thinking about the future and what steps you're beginning to take. Now, there will be some issues on which maybe there is no possibility of compromise. So pollution, effluent treatment, for instance. You have ZLD legislation, right? Zero liquid discharge. So you can't afford on those issues to say, I'll take a date in 2030 or 2040. The day you start your operation, you have to have all of those effluent treatment operations in place. So some of it costs money, but a lot of it doesn't necessarily need to cost. And certainly the stuff on SNG doesn't require capital investment. A lot of the stuff on E will require capital investment, but it can be calibrated over a period of time.
Sure, very, very realistic one. You give 2 examples, partly about, HUL, Reliance. But maybe if you could share more in terms of if any particular company, whether in India or abroad, which has done a tremendous work in ESG, because there are now just not the companies which is having sustainability officers, but in countries like Singapore and abroad, they are having regulators having a post like a chief sustainability officer. And I think they are kind of making it mandatory for a couple of companies, to follow ESG norms. So any example on that front that you recollect, sir?
Well, my favorite example has to be the company I worked with, which is the Tata Group. So maybe just to go back to those points I made about the tone at the top, the creation of a governance structure, communication, measurement. So if you look back at the Tatas, first of all, I think the ownership structure of the group is such that it lends itself almost obviously to a pro-ESG kind of stance. So the fact that 2/3 of the ownership of the holding company, Tata Sons, is held by charities whose commitment is to really invest in public welfare, I think you start on the right sort of pedestal, if you will. Then the mission statement. So when I was in Tata's, we crafted a mission statement, which is pretty much in sync with what we've been doing for the previous century. And the mission statement is really to improve the quality of life of the communities you serve through long-term stakeholder value creation based on leadership and trust. So this idea that you're committed to improving the quality of life of communities, again, is already pushing you in that direction, all your companies, to do what is in the general public welfare, public interest, which is aligned with your ownership structure. So I think that tone at the top was very well set with that, and then the value system and the vision statement that we announced and so on. Then creating the governance structure. So in Tata Sons, we created this organization called the Tata Sustainability Group. And the head of that, who in fact reported to me, I was the chair of our Sustainability Council, which had all our CEOs as part of it. And then we had the Sustainability Group, which also had its head. So you had a locus of governance to look at what the group was doing across diverse ESG areas. I can share that one of the very important elements which pushed us to move faster on climate change was around 2015 or 16, I think it was, when Norges Bank, which was one of the large investors in Tata Power, they held a little over a 1% stake in the company. And Tata Power is a listed company, of course, and they were one of the largest shareholders. Overnight, decided to pull their investment in the company because they had decided that they would decarbonize their entire portfolio. Because at that point of time, Tata Power was primarily a coal-fired thermal power producer, they decided they're going to sell their stake. And of course, short term, you saw a sudden sort of shift in the stock price. And subsequently, it has led to a series of events, including Tata Power's announcement more recently that they would not create any more coal-fired thermal installations. And they've in fact now become one of the country's largest renewable power producers. So that really opened our eyes to the fact that this climate agenda is moving really fast, that investors were making calls on their holdings in companies based on their sense of how serious you were and how committed you were. So then we put in place a series of training programs. We used to, at that time, work with the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. We sent, I think, over 150 of the various Tata CEOs and CXOs for training programs in Cambridge, in UK. We created 500 climate champions, 500 water champions across the Tata Group companies. So this is all a genuine effort to help companies figure out where they are on this journey and how quickly they need to move. So you had the governance structure also in place. And then communication, newsletters, you create various fora, environment weeks, you do events and create more awareness and interest. We had significant volunteering programs where many of the employees would want to participate along with their families and picked environmentally focused sort of agendas to participate. We worked with a number of nonprofits. Our CSR spends are obviously amongst the highest in the country. At that time, we used to spend, I think, close to 700 crores a year on CSR. So I think all of this, then there's a natural alignment. And then, of course, measuring and reporting. So some of our companies are the first in the country to start integrated reporting. GRI, of course, many of our companies used to do. So I think it's the whole basket of
No, great that you started talking about Tata, because those were the next questions that I had. But when you said about natural, alignment, please tell us more about it, because obviously Tatas are the biggest brand of not only just India, but, all over the world, and everybody borrows that for, later word called Tata. And most of the new companies try to, copy what they do. So ESG terms came right now, in a couple of years, but Tata has been doing it since ages. So how do they do it, because it looks like they have been following ages. So how do they do it? Like you said, it's because of the trust which is owning the companies, and, it's a natural alignment, or anything else. If you could share more details on that.
No, I think it's all the stuff that I talked about. The fact that right at the top, there has been a commitment at the level of the chairman and the boards of our companies to wanting to do the right thing vis-a-vis your stakeholders and communities. The fact that it's written into your core purpose. So when employees join the group, they are told what is your mission. So the sense that, this is what we're all about. This is who we are. This is what we stand for. I think that's very critical, because then the culture gets set. Once the culture is set, then a lot of things become much easier. I think what Tatas have done right is in starting with that alignment right at the top. And then you need to have these mechanisms, right? Your governance structure, ways in which employees can feel that they're involved in a bigger project beyond themselves. The work that the charities do is important, because I think for employees, the sense that the harder you work, the more profit you generate, the more will actually go back to the communities you support, which is part of your core purpose, via the charities. So I think there's a sort of 360-degree fulfillment of why you're doing what you're doing, why it matters to communities, and therefore how you're fulfilling your core purpose. If you can achieve that, then it's, I think, much easier. And then, of course, you need all the stuff I talked about, the events, the activities, people to sort of feel engaged and participate. and the reporting, because that indirectly puts pressure on you, right? The more you report, the more disclosure you make, the more people ask you questions and want to see you do even better. And then year on year, you have to keep tracking your progress. So that becomes very important, which is what I was referring to with the BRSR. Earlier, it was voluntary, right? The kind of reporting you did under the business responsibility reports. But now with the BRSR and the fact that from next year, your auditors will have to start auditing, starting, of course, with the top 150 companies and then cascading to all 1,000. And the fact that you now need to start also including your supply chain, which includes many SMEs, I think there'll be more and more pressure on companies to make sure that the data is accurate. And when you report it, then there will be pressure from the markets, there'll be pressure from other stakeholders that they want to see constant improvement. It's not good enough to say that I've just done this and then the next 5 years, there's no improvement. People expect to see a progression. So I think in Tata's case, that has held true. And I think they've genuinely been committed to trying to do better year on year.
So I buy your points and I really liked it. And when you say genuinely committed, this is a leadership summit, and we'll put this on the ETCFO website also, this conversation about the lessons that you're sharing. And hence, we would like you to tell us more about none other than Mr. Ratan Tata. How has been your experience working with him? What are the leadership lessons that you learned from him? I'm sure it will be very helpful for the CFOs who will watch and who are listening to this conversation.
So just FYI, I worked with Ratan Tata for 12 years. I started as his executive assistant and then I was his chief of staff. I left him in 2008. So a lot of my interaction was 96 to 2008. But it was a very interesting period for the Tata Group because this was when India had just started opening up as an economy. We had all the multinationals piling in, and many of the Tata businesses at that time were under serious pressure, whether it was motors, whether it was steel, power, and so on. We were also starting to get into some new industries, including telecoms, where I spent several initially profitable and then subsequently very unprofitable years. So there's a lot that was happening in the group. So one learned a lot at that point of time. About him as a person, I think the point I made about tone at the top, he was the last chairman of Tata's who was also chair of the Tata Charities. And I think that synergy, therefore, between the work of the charities and the work of Tata Sons, and therefore all the Tata listed companies and the big Tata companies, I think was almost enshrined in his personality. And he was somebody who cared deeply and cares deeply about the direction the group was taking. So things like our mission statement, a lot of it was really evolved in his time. It was in his time in 1998 that Tata's came out for the first time, even with a code of conduct. So I think that commitment to ethics, to building on the group's reputation for trust, to giving some formality to many of these structures, to appointing chief ethics officers, all of that, I think, very much happened in his time. As a person, I think a couple of things, since you're talking about leadership, that I found amazing in him. One was curiosity. He's a pilot. I don't think he flies anymore, of course. But somebody who was very interested in technology. And in the 1980s, he actually wrote 2 versions of a strategic plan for the Tata Group, a lot of which was focused on high technology for the future, including big foray into computers, into information technology. And it was under him that you saw the dramatic rise of TCS. I remember when I joined the group, TCS was a few hundred crores in revenue. And now, of course, it is the largest contributor to market cap and one of the largest contributors to revenue in Tata's. He was the person who pushed us into a number of joint ventures, many of which unfortunately failed. Failed in the sense that the joint venture partners took over, but IBM, when they came into the country, they came in as Tata IBM. We were manufacturing computers. Honeywell, when they came in a partnership with Tata, it was Tata Honeywell, and a number of other joint ventures. So I think the idea that the group's future would be determined to a large extent by our ability to succeed in areas of high technology was something that he firmly believed in and was able to push through because of his innate curiosity, his interest in what was really changing the future. And I think if you want to be a successful leader, you need to read widely, you need to be exposed to different trends, the kind of stuff you guys are doing through the day. You need to have a sense of what is really moving markets and what's coming down the pipe. So that was something I saw very strongly in him. The other thing that um, I'll say is that he was extremely humble and very grounded. In all the years I worked with him, I probably saw him lose his temper once. And lose his temper meaning he slightly raised his voice. But he was extremely humble, very grounded, somebody who would give respect to all the people in the organization. In airports, he'd carry his own bags. These days, you see people with retinues around them, somebody carrying a briefcase, somebody carrying a newspaper. He was never like that. He hated having any kind of crowd around him or people seeking attention by just being around him. So I think early on in life, when you see people of stature who conduct themselves in a very respectful way, it leaves its mark. And you get your job done. You don't have to be somebody who's the loudest voice in a room. But when you speak, people should want to listen to you. And I think with him, it was very much that was the case. At the same time, I think he also knew how to reach out for advice, for inputs. And he'd take it from some really funny quarters also. So it wasn't that only the managing director and the two CXOs below that would sort of be the people he'd rely on. He'd talk to managers, he'd talk to young people. I was part of the Tata Administrative Service, so he talked to task officers and understand what's going on. So I think leadership, you need to be open to communication, be somebody who's accessible and get inputs that can help you to really articulate and put together a sound strategy after having taken multiple insights and information from people. So I think he was very good at that. Last thing I'll end with is the kind of boldness of vision. I mean, those acquisitions we did, for instance, whether it was Chorus Steel, Jaguar Land Rover, I don't think huge acquisitions, which almost sort of bet the bank, would have been possible under any other person. I think he had the charisma, he had the stature to pull off those acquisitions by aligning the board behind him, getting the finance people united. Unfortunately, in those cases, we did those acquisitions just before the global financial crisis. But who predicted that? Nobody knew it was coming down the pipe. Maybe we would have done it differently. But I think the fact that you could contemplate something that's big, hairy, and audacious was again something I saw in a very visionary leader.
Amazing points. But how did he actually change the wheels of the car when the car was running? Because so many businesses he entered into it. Acquiring Chorus, Jaguar Land Rover was the biggest deals. Perhaps you would have gone bankrupt if you would have made mistakes there. And not just that, look at insurance. You bought AIG here. Look at Chroma. Look at other businesses, the fashion and everything. So, I mean, so many businesses. So what made him so confident about, getting into these businesses? How did you observe it and what was your learning?
No, the first thing is that it wasn't that you went in blind, right? You went in with a lot of preparation and thought, despite which a lot of this didn't work out, right? And we can discuss that separately. But the 1990s was really a period when you had to defend your home turf. You did it in two ways. One, you tried to make the company stronger. And there were a lot of interventions around that. I think quality was perhaps the biggest. I mean, people today forget that there was a time when Indian quality, generally in manufacturing, was lousy. You had a protected economy, a lot of products and services just didn't work. Light bulbs, I remember, you used to buy new light bulbs, you screw it on and it won't work, right? So I think the quality movement in Tata's, he created something called the Tata Quality Management Services, which is patterned on the Malcolm Baldrige assessment system. That helped to take our quality standards up. That was very important. I think the code of conduct, formalizing the whole approach to business, that there were some things that we would do, some things we would not. The way we would conduct ourselves, which is really something to strengthen stakeholders' trust in the group, that is very important. And then the strategy. I think he created what was called the Tata Strategic Management Group, TSMG, which is like our in-house McKinsey, BCG, Bain, whatever you want to call it. And some really smart people were brought in there. They were the ones who had, in the 80s, worked with him on the strategic plans of the group. So figuring out where we need to play. So defend your home turf, Where you think you don't have the technology or the smarts, bring in partners. That's where, as you said, AIG, IBM, Honeywell, all of these, Mercedes-Benz. Mercedes-Benz came to India in a partnership with Tata Motors. So all of this happened at that time through the 1990s. I think in the 2000s, once we felt strong in our own backyard, then the whole internationalization phase started. That, okay, we can compete in India, now let's try and compete overseas. Because sooner or later, you're going to have to fight the big boys if they're not already in your country. And that started internationalization. Some of it organic, a lot of it was the inorganic route. Inorganic because you felt it was easier to get into certain markets by, in a sense, buying market share, buying access to technology, buying a brand in the case of Jaguar Land Rover, which is what we did. So the point I'm making is that the internationalization, which is where some of the big hairy bets took place, happened when he was almost 15 years into his term as chairman. He became chairman in 1991. The Jaguar and Chorus acquisitions took place in 2007. He retired in 2012. So it's not that you went in blind, it's not that you went in overnight. There was a long period of preparation, understanding whether you have the capability, strengthening your finances, making sure you have the right management talent, because all these acquisitions also have to be managed, right? And having a point of view on how you would actually manage some of this. And only when he felt we were ready, then we did it. And then again, we didn't do it all at once. We did a number of smaller acquisitions. If you look at Tata's in 2004, 2005, in auto, for instance, before we did the big one with JLR, we acquired Daewoo, the heavy commercial vehicles business in Korea. So you'd already had some experience of acquisitions overseas and how to manage them. And then you went for the big ones. So I think everything has to be measured and calibrated. You don't do things overnight in business.
Certainly very meaningful. Maybe one or two last questions, but I will take maybe one or two quick questions from the audience as well. So be ready with your question if you have. One question to you, sir, and is you mentioned that a lot of companies are now looking at ESG, in a meaningful manner because of whatever BRSR norms. Also, there are chief sustainability officers. What kind of developments specifically do you see in the ESG area going ahead, maybe in 2 to 3 years? Do you think that the companies will not have chief sustainability officer just to tick the boxes and work also in a meaningful and a purposeful manner, or they will just do it for the sake of compliance? How do you see it going ahead?
No, there will be many companies that will sort of have to be dragged, kicking and pushing before they sort of really genuinely fall in line. So that inevitably happens. But I think they will be the first ones to sort of get exposed. And I think in the next 2-3 years, you'll start seeing a lot of detailed commentary, what you call naming and shaming, right? It'll start in the media. So there may not be a financial repercussion from the regulatory side just yet in terms of penalties and fines if the regulator doesn't feel you're doing it seriously. But it'll come from the markets, it'll come from public opinion, it'll come in the media. It'll then reflect itself in investors saying, this company is getting pilloried on the front page of this newspaper because they've got some lousy effluent treatment process, or they've just ended up with 15 workers getting killed on site. I'm not going to invest in this company. And the first investors will do that will be the Nordics. So the equivalents of the Norges Bank will say that we won't have nothing to do with this. So you'll see the investor implications coming in. Then you'll have the customers who will say that, this brand is not for me. It doesn't sync with my values. I'm going to. What we don't have so much yet in India is, both on the customer and on the investor side, the kind of activism that you see in Europe or in the United States. But I can assure you it's coming. I think people are drawing their own lessons from some of the big activist things that you've seen the last 2-3 years around a range of issues, including in our markets on short selling. So people will see that these can actually drive change and influence corporate behavior. You will start seeing customers calling for boycotts of companies. You'll start seeing investors getting together and saying, we don't trust this management, let's push for the management's exit. You're beginning to see that with some of the startups that had fantastic reputations. Suddenly, nobody wants to do business with them. So I think if you are hoping to get by ticking the box and you've got some person in administration, you say, chalo usko CSO bana dete hain on paper, but he has no real job definition that speaks to sustainability, I think he'll get found out very quickly. I think the larger companies are already falling in line, and for many of them, actually, they need to see their supply chain partners also fall in line. Some of it is a reporting issue, which is not only relevant in India. If you're exporting to Europe, for instance, you have to demonstrate that the way your product has been put together, there are compliances down the line. People will start surprise checks and audits to check on that. So I think you will also have compliance requirements in other markets, and the big companies understand that. If you're in steel today, for instance, and you're trying to export into Europe, if you're not today already having plans to measure your scope 3 emissions, which is the hardest to do, your product may not be allowed to enter Europe. There are already going to be duties as part of the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So I think the smarter companies get it and will drive change down the line. The smaller companies may have a little bit of a window to delay, but sooner or later, everyone, I think, will have to fall in line.
Sure, I think I will just take a small pause here. Anybody has any question? Hope a lot of them. Can we have a mic there?
Hello, sir. My name is Nilesh Vijayvargi. Sir, I have a question. I think one thing which you touched upon, the tone at the top, which is definitely very important. At the same time, I think what happens is getting overboard with this ESG requirement or compliance. Would that become probably more of a window dressing where people really want to comply with the requirement, at the same time earn some good points from a valuation point of view? That's one. And second thing is, don't you think that whether it would increase the cost of the product or the service which the company is catering to, and it would impact the end consumer? What's your thought around that?
So I'm quite clear that, in fact, we had that discussion on, does all of this necessarily cost? And my point was, all of this doesn't necessarily cost. Secondly, when you have disclosure, I think it is informing the market better and giving people an opportunity to make their own choices. As I said, nobody is necessarily expecting that change will come overnight and that you have to change in all the ESG parameters. Now, there's an ESG rating provider in India, Equite, which says that they're tracking over 1,000 ESG measures. I don't think anyone seriously expects that on 1,000 different measures, you're going to seriously improve dramatically over a period of short period of time. What I think the market would want to understand is on the 4 or 5 handful, single digit number, material issues that impact your business, are you doing something meaningful? And even that something meaningful doesn't have to be overnight. I gave the example of net zero targets for climate transition. As long as you have a target, it is somewhere out there in the future, and you have a way of incrementally building up towards that, I think the markets are happy. So the question is, what is in the company's own interest and its stakeholders' interest, including its shareholders? Is it in the company's interest that you have a way of understanding what are the expectations and how can I best address those in a way that balances? So you will need to balance between what the regulator wants, what the shareholder wants, what the employee wants. Everyone will want the best of everything for themselves. You can't deliver. And the simplest example is employee salaries, right? Better you pay, the more loyal and better retention you'll have. But then the more you pay, that means the less is available for the shareholder. So there'll always be a balance. But people expect that you're applying your mind to this, you're understanding where the risks are coming from and what the opportunities are. And as long as you have an articulated stance on it, I think people are by and large going to be happy. The greenwashing, the window dressing starts when people want to show that they're better than their peers, perhaps, or ahead of the market, leading the way, pioneering, doing something which they're actually not. And my argument is, A, there is no case for doing that, because nobody, as I said, is expecting you to change overnight. But if you're going to lie and pretend and fake it, right, then chances are you'll get caught out. And that's why the regulator has said, look, it's fine that all this disclosure is happening, but from next year, I want the audits to also happen. Because right now, it's in a sense self-reporting. I have no way of being sure whether the data the company's report is accurate or not. From next year, let it get audited. All they're asking for right now is for you to report. They're not setting a standard. They aren't saying on scope 1 emissions, you have to be 0. On scope 2, you have to be 0. On scope 3, you have to be 0. They're saying just measure it and tell us what it is. So I think the act of us getting you to figure out, what my numbers are, where the risk may be embedded, and how I need to present a strategy to the market. I think that is where we are right now, and that is, I think, in everyone's best interest. And companies that try and game the system because they somehow want to see, themselves being better than the rest, they will get found out the first. And that's why I said that I think it'll start in the media. There'll be naming and shaming. People will get exposed. Then customers will respond. Investors will respond. So I think in companies' best interest, if they start getting with the program now, it's in everyone's best interest. Yeah.
Good afternoon, sir. Myself, K.N. Thakur from NTPC. Sir, you have rightly said that we are all working in a change environment, and ESG is also not exception to this. My question is how to navigate in that case, because any change in this environment will leads to cost increase. I just wanted to know how to navigate in that case.
No, but as I said, everything doesn't have cost. So, diversity in your workforce, for instance, if you took gender, for whatever reason, if you say gender is a material issue for me, partly because I work in India. In India, we have one of the lowest female labor force participation rates in the world. I want to increase that. I want to create a better working environment so that women join, and the ones who join then don't leave, and have enough women who rise to the top. Then at every level in your employment strategy, you want to make sure that there are enough women. That doesn't cost any money. And yet it's a very important part of the S of ESG. So my first point would be that everything doesn't have a cost attached to it. Some of it is just a stance and a plan to really improve your numbers. But where there is cost, I think again you have to do it in a calibrated fashion. Don't overnight want to change everything. NTPC, has now taken a decision that they'll gradually but surely also go bigger in renewables. So you're making those investments. I think you're doing it the right way. You're also conscious that you're a big employer. You have a large number of stakeholders who are reliant on your existing thermal power operations. You can't shut those down overnight. If at all it had to come to a stage where you had to shut down some of the older plants, there has to be a way to be found to finance that and to retrain the employees who are there and then, in a sense, create what is called a just transition. So I think solutions can be found. And if it's an issue of cost, it can be undertaken gradually over a period of time. What the market wants to hear, however, is that NTPC leadership is conscious about these issues and has a plan. And this is the plan. The plan may take 25 years to execute, but there is a plan. So don't worry about the costs having to be incurred overnight. And a lot of ESG doesn't have any cost attached to it. That's the point I'd like to make.
Sure, thanks. Wish I could have actually taken more questions. There were more hands, but the time is up, sir. We have to stop here. But thank you so much. This was very, very meaningful and enlightening, actually. Thanks for taking time out and sharing these thoughts with us. And thank you so much for your attention and the questions as well. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah.